But I also want to be clear. Anybody who thinks it's time to play militia, F around and find out. Anybody who thinks it's time to insult, to deride, to mistreat, to threaten people, F around and find out. We do have the cuffs, we do have the jail cells, we do have the Philly juries, and we have the state prisons. So if you're going to try to turn an election into some form of coercion, if you're going to try to bully people, bully votes or voters, you're going to try to erase votes, you're going to try any of that nonsense, we're not playing. F around and find out.
Do you ever stop and think, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where the day before an election, the Philly DA needs to come out and say something like that?
F around and find out.
And he's not alone. We've seen government officials across the country issue warnings to their communities that any sort of voter suppression or intimidation would not be tolerated. But they're doing it because it's becoming more and more commonplace. We've seen incidents all over the country during early voting of people harassing and threatening poll workers or voters, trying to scare people away, trying to dissuade them from voting for their preferred candidate. All of it is anti-democratic, and all of it can be laid at the foot of Trump. It's not an overstatement to say that Trump has made the political rhetoric in this country much worse, much more aggressive, and much more violent. Look at just some of the things that his supporters have said.
You don't think Donald Trump is a fascist?
No, not by any means possible.
And what would you like to see the military do when Trump becomes president?
I'd like to see the military go after everybody in Washington, D.C. and arrest them all. And the ones that are guilty, they need to be hung. And they need to be hung in public.
And you'd like Donald Trump to do that?
I'd like the military to do that.
With Donald Trump's blessing?
Absolutely.
And do you think Donald Trump's a fascist?
No.
And the right can split hairs over the use of the word fascist, like you're about to see from Tim Scott here in a second. But really, that's who Trump is.
We're not seeing the coverage of 2 assassination attempts on CNN
we
against
did
Donald Trump.
wall-to-wall
We're
coverage.
not seeing the comments about Kamala Harris talking about fascists, calling Donald Trump a fascist.
John Kelly
We
called
should
him a
focus on,
fascist.
giving
His
the
former
American
chief of
people
staff.
the opportunity, giving, and she repeated it, giving people the
Well, wouldn't
opportunity
you?
to make
If
their own
Kamala
decisions.
Harris's former
That's
chief
what we
of staff
Americans-
called her a fascist, I would guess that you would repeat it too. And Donald Trump has called him one as well.
The policies, the positions, the behaviors, all of it can be described as fascist. A militarized and authoritarian government designed to crush your political opponents is, by nature, fascist.
I mean, she pledged to include Republicans in her cabinet. I'm not sure I've ever seen a Democratic candidate do that. She has invited prominent Republican elected officials to campaign with her on the trail. I don't think you see that a lot.
But she also called him a fascist, right? She also called him a fascist. That's no way to break bread and make peace. Right?
Well, she said, she said that she did not disagree with his chief of staff, who said that, somebody who knows him well. And again,
do you think, Mayor, that
Kelly
Donald Trump is a fascist? Do you think he's that?
I don't think General Kelly is wrong. He knows Donald Trump much better than I do, and I would not contradict General Kelly in his assessment of his former boss. Look, we've never seen a president have his own chief of staff or his own vice president not support him. And by the same token, we've never seen a Democrat have that many Republicans who do support her. But I think the most important thing is the difference in the closing message between him talking about turning guns on people who disagree with him and her saying that if you're a Republican, you will have a seat at the table in my administration.
And he gets away with a lot of it because he scapegoats marginalized communities and especially immigrants as part of the rhetoric.
The two parties would get together and say, let's just stop this name calling, right? Let's just focus on the issues. But this is not a normal world. Donald Trump is not a normal candidate. And I think it's not a stretch to call Donald Trump a fascist. You talked about the people in his cabinet that spoke the same way. You know, he's talking about the enemy within and going after people using the military. He's talked about mass deportations where, you know, they'll stop people on the street and check their papers. What does that remind you of? Talking about, you know, knocking on doors and pulling people out and deporting them. What does that remind you of? That's pretty damn close to fascism, if not the definition of fascism.
It's important to remember, but easy to lose sight of, the fact that this is not normal. This is not who we are. This is not who we have to be. And this is not conditions that we have to accept. Trump and the MAGA movement have totally transformed our political system. Now you have, across the country, aspiring mini Trumps running for Congress, running for state-level positions, and it's totally transformed the Republican Party. His behavior and rhetoric has shifted the Overton window so far to the right that people have just accepted this type of behavior as normal and essentially the status quo. But thankfully, there are people speaking up and speaking out.
Democrats have been calling him a fascist and other names for a long time. There's plenty of blame to go around.
Republicans too.
Hold on a second.
A fascist is not a name. A fascist is a bunch of things that add up to a way of being. They're calling him a fascist because he's behaving like a fascist, because he's talking about poisoning the blood of the nation, and because he's talking about rounding up political enemies, and because he's acting like a demigod, and because he's saying the rules don't apply to me, and because he's saying I'm going to close up the free press, I'm going to close your schools if you don't do what I say. He's acting like a fascist. That's why we're calling him a fascist.
Again, it's not really about Trump the person, it's about Trump behavior. It's about Trump policies. It's about the MAGA movement. And now in an election cycle where people are worried about the outcome and potentially the right challenging the results in court to try to cheat and steal, or any sort of violence in the aftermath of the election, people are worried about the future of democracy. But the right is trying to deflect by saying it's just a character attack on Trump. It's important to distinguish.
When you've had to compromise so much to get to the kind of person you are today, it takes a long time to look and say, okay, what we did was wrong. Well, you're never going to admit that. Humans don't admit mistakes. They don't admit fallacy. So what's going to happen is J.D. Vance or Vivek Ramaswamy or somebody like that is going to inherit the mantle of Trumpism. And while Trump has a specific superpower, like this unique evil thing he does, you know, the reality is he's articulate in his own way. We have to give him that. But J.D. Vance and Vivek Ramaswamy, as an example, are articulate in the way that we all, you know, define articulate. And it's going to be tough for we're going to have to continue to push back against that narrative and against that thing. And the question is, do we want to rebuild this coalition in 2 years when we need it? Or do we want to just keep it steamrolling so that we can steamroll these guys? And that's what I want to do.
Of course, Trump is not going to be around forever. He's old, he's ailing, his heart isn't in it anymore, and he's done after this cycle, no matter what. But the stain on the American political system and ultimately the rightward fascist shift in the Republican Party can't be overstated. Because again, you have people who are acting as copycats trying to replicate his success for their own political and personal gain. They're going to rely on the same rhetoric, they're going to try to employ the same tactics, they're going to challenge the results of their own elections at the lower level. Down the ballot, you're going to see mini Trumps try to employ fascist behavior for political expedience. One step, of course, to stop it is voting, but it goes beyond election day and it goes beyond just voting. To really stop this growing fascist movement in this country, you need to be engaged after Election Day. What are you doing in December, January, March, April, going on for the next 4 years until the next presidential election? What are you doing? We all need to be involved at the state and local level. We need to read up, we need to participate, and we need to show up because it goes beyond voting. If you really want to crush this fascist movement in this country, you need a strong and robust grassroots movement in place to stop it in its tracks. And I know we can do it.